Well, hello everyone. Excuse the bare face. I just walked my dogs and our lawnmower is on the fritz. We have a robotic lawnmower in our backyard and I think one of the wires broke. There's an underground wire that tells it where to go, and I think one of them is damaged. So it's on the fritz, and I don't like high grass. So I was using the trimmer to cut the grass, and I got a little bit sweaty, and after I'm done making this video I'm probably going to go and hose off. And once I'm done doing that, I'm not going to want to put on makeup, so I just decided to do a naked faced video today, and hopefully nobody will be offended. Fortunately, I'm not trying to impress anyone anyway, not that I can, but I just wanted to pop on for a moment and talk a little bit about the trip I just took to Vilnius, Lithuania, which I'm now in the process of writing up on my travel blog. That was a very fascinating trip for me on many levels because I used to live in the former Soviet Union. I went there in 1995. To the Republic of Armenia, which is very far south. It actually borders Iran and Turkey. Lithuania, of course, is a Baltic country, and it borders Russia and Poland, Belarus, Latvia. And it was a very mind-opening place to go. First off, because I went to Armenia a couple of years ago, and it has really changed and advanced a lot, but it's not really even in the same league as Lithuania. Lithuania is really nice. And it used to be a Peace Corps country, which really is shocking. The Baltic countries all were Peace Corps countries. And I'm sure it wasn't easy. At the same time, like, you'd never know. You'd never know that this country, other than a few Soviet-era buildings that I saw in Vilnius, granted, didn't look at the rest of the country, and I'm sure there's still plenty of those cookie-cutter buildings all over, but it's just really a very advanced, nice place. And I have to tell you, I learned a lot about what happens when a regime takes over. Visiting Lithuania, the first thing that happened was we went to the cathedral, which was right by our hotel. And I mentioned in my video about climbing the tower that we went to the crypt, which is underneath the cathedral. And there's a very long history. Lithuania happens to be, I believe it was the last country in Europe to accept Christianity. However, it is a very religious city, or country, I'm sorry. Vilnius is a city, but Lithuania is a country. From what I observed, it appeared to be a very religious country. I saw so many nuns and priests and churches everywhere. And there were, Orthodox churches and Protestant churches and Catholic churches. But during the Soviet era, of course, they were not allowed to practice Christianity. And so this big cathedral that was right by our hotel was hundreds of years old. And there were hundreds of people buried under it in the crypts. That was, during the Soviet era, a concert hall and picture gallery. And the guide was talking about how fortunate that was, because in the Soviet era, they wanted to turn that building into a factory or a warehouse. And it wasn't uncommon for churches to be destroyed or ruined, or used for things like storing equipment or basketball court or movie theater for the soldiers. That was one thing that I saw a couple of years ago. I went to Latvia. Liepaja is the name of the city we went to, and we visited Karosta prison. And afterwards, we visited an Orthodox church, beautiful church, and it had really nice acoustics. And as a singer, I really appreciate that. And they were talking about how in the Soviet era, that church had been turned into a movie theater and social hall for the soldiers that lived in that area. There's still a military base there. And they ruined the acoustics. Like, they just came in and messed up the whole construction. I think they did actually manage to repair it, and it is a church again now. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but I just happened to notice this. And so after we visited that, we went to a museum that is housed in what was a KGB headquarters. The name of the museum is Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights. And it was all about how Lithuania was overtaken by the Soviets after the Nazis left. And I'm sorry to tell you that reading some of the descriptions of what happened was eerily reminiscent of what we've been seeing in the last few months. Some people might think this is hyperbole, but it's not really. And I used to live in the Soviet Union. I went to Armenia in 1995. That was less than 3 years after it fell apart completely. And things were still very Soviet when I went there. It's now much nicer in Yerevan, where I lived, but it's nowhere on the same league as Lithuania. Lithuania, or Vilnius, really, that was a Peace Corps country, and it's hard to believe now it is not in any need of that. I mean, it's just this beautiful Western city. But it took them some time to recover. And it was a stark reminder that growing up in the 70s and 80s, when we all heard about how commies were bad and how, the Soviet Union was bad, and you just assume that these people are all your enemies, not even really stopping to consider that they didn't want to be Soviets. They didn't want to be aligned with the Russians. Armenia was a little bit different. In Armenia, I never got the sense that they necessarily were as upset about being occupied by the Russians, because I think that they saw it as being rescued from Turkey. But in Lithuania, they didn't want to give up their culture or their faith or their mores or their language or their beloved cathedral, so that the Soviet Union could have its power and everything. But this museum that we saw, it was mind-opening. And they did show at the bottom some cells where people were kept, political prisoners. Probably, in some ways, better conditions than maybe some of the places that people are being deported to now. But it was sobering to me. And the same attitudes that were prevalent back then, I'm seeing now. I really think that if you have a chance to ever go to Lithuania, if you can go to Vilnius, I would highly recommend going to that museum. I wanted to go to the one in Riga a couple of years ago, but did not have a chance. I hope we can go and visit there and see that museum. Yerevan does not have a KGB museum. And I don't know why. I'm sure it's coming. My guess, though, is that they were not as upset about occupation. I don't know if it's making any sense. It makes sense to me because for the last 30 years or so, I've been kind of a buff of the former Soviet Union and the history behind it. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And, I watched Red Dawn like everybody else did in 1984 when they were, propagandizing about the Soviet Union and people coming in and parachutes and taking over and forcing us to live the commie lifestyle. And I think that a lot of Americans are not realizing that that is happening right now. But some of it may have to do with Russia. But a lot of it has to do with just plain old rich, ignorant, greedy assholes who just want more money and power for themselves. So that's about all I got to say. I'm disgusting myself. I need to go and clean up. But if this made any sense, I hope you will think about it. And yeah, I will probably make a parody or sing a song or something. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it'll happen today.